Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rula Deeb. I'm a senior principal at Geosyntec in Oakland, California, and the coordinator of the webinar series on behalf of SERDP and ESTCP. This webinar will consist of a brief overview of both programs, followed by technical content on securing DoD control systems and infrastructure from cyber threats. First, Dr. Jonathan Butts and Mr. Billy Rios from QED Secure Solutions will talk about a new baseline automated security enumeration and configuration tool to rapidly identify vulnerable and misconfigured building automation systems associated with DoD building and energy infrastructure. This presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. Then Mr. Colin Dunn from Fund Incorporated will discuss the use of low-cost data diodes for facility equipment monitoring to meet the needs of critical infrastructure managers across DoD by quickly enabling secure access to equipment data. Colin's presentation will also be followed by a Q&A session, and we will conclude the webinar with a longer Q&A session featuring today's three speakers. The next several slides provide instructions on optimizing your webinar experience. If you have not done so already, please download Zoom at the link shown here and provided to you in the webinar registration confirmation email. If you are unable to download Zoom, you may view the slides using a compatible internet browser such as Firefox, IE, or Edge, and by creating a free Zoom account. If you're unable to view the slide because your screen freezes, just by keying in Control and F5, and that will perform a hard refresh. If you are accessing the audio through your computer, click the arrow next to the Join Audio button, select Test Speakers and Microphones, and follow the prompts as they appear on your screen. If you continue to have technical difficulties, just call into the conference line shown here. You may also submit a comment using the chat box. Please use the chat box only for comments related to technical difficulties. The Q&A option in Zoom should be reserved for questions for our speakers. In case of continued technical issues, you can download a PDF of the slides from the webinar webpage and call into the conference line provided to you in your webinar registration confirmation email. Note that we will also be live streaming the webinar on the SERDP and ESTCP YouTube channel at the link shown here, and that's another option for you to follow the presentation. Today's broadcast will be listen only. You may submit questions, again, by using the Q&A box on your screen and not the chat box. Do not wait until the Q&A period to submit your questions. We do encourage you to submit them as you think of them. And when you submit your questions, please make sure to add your organization name at the end so that we can identify it during the Q&A session. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Timothy Tetro, who's the ESTCP Program Manager for the Energy and Water Program Area. Before joining SERDP and ESTCP, Tim worked at the National Renewable Energy Lab, where he focused on energy efficiency and renewable energy project development for the federal sector. Tim, please proceed.
Thank you, Rula, and welcome everybody to today's SERDP and ESTCP webinar. I'm going to go over some slides giving an overview of the program, and then I'll hand it back over to get started with the presentation. SERDP is the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program established in 1991 by Congress as a partnership between the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and the EPA. SERDP's mission is to identify and address high-priority environmental science and technology opportunities that focus on DoD requirements. And SERDP funds both fundamental research as well as advanced technology development, ultimately to impact real-world environmental management. And ESTCP is the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program in which we demonstrate innovative environmental and energy technologies. These investments capitalize on past investments under SERDP or other research programs and are designed to transition technologies out of the lab and into the field. Especially important in all ESTCP demonstrations is the ultimate transition to implementation and regulatory acceptance. SERDP and ESTCP are complementary programs with much of SERDP research occurring at the lab and pilot scale with occasional field efforts, while ESTCP demonstrations are primarily at the pilot and field scale, while occasionally are supported by lab efforts, various facilities. There are 4 program areas in SERDP and 5 in ESTCP. The Installation, Energy, and Water program area is only in ESTCP, while the other 4, environmental restoration, munitions response, resource conservation and resiliency, weapon systems and platforms, are SERDP and ESTCP programs managed jointly by a designated program manager. Our webinar today is focused on research and demonstrations conducted under the Installation and Energy and Water program area. Installation, Energy, and Water has essentially 3 main areas of research. First is smart and secure installation energy management, and then efficient integrated buildings and components, and third, distributed energy generation. Our webinar series highlights research and demonstration efforts from each of the 5 program areas. As you can see, upcoming webinars will cover a broad range of topics, including PFAS, fate, and transport in subsurface environments, addressing threatened and endangered species on DoD lands, advances in cold spray repair technologies, munitions distribution, mobility, and burial in underwater environments, managing AFFF impacts, and assessment of commercially available fluorine-free foams. You can find additional information about upcoming webinars at this link. I would like to remind you that a copy of the presentation of today's session can be downloaded from our webinar page. And we would appreciate if you would please take a few minutes at the end of the presentation to complete a survey that will pop up on your screen at the end of the webcast. And finally, I'd like to remind you that poster abstracts for the 2020 SERDP and ESTCP Symposium are due on August 14th. The SERDP and ESTCP Symposium is a 3-day virtual event this year, showcasing the latest technologies that enhance DoD's mission through improved environmental energy performance. And I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. And with that, I'll hand it back to Rula.
Thank you, Tim. It is now time to introduce the 2 presenters for our first technical presentation. We have Dr. Jonathan Butts, who's a retired Air Force officer and co-founder of QED Secure Solutions. Jonathan is the committee chair for the International Federation for Information Processing, or ISIP, the working group on critical infrastructure protection. He has served as a representative to the Institute for Information Infrastructure Protection, advisor to the Cybersecurity Education Consortium, member of the Department of Homeland Security Research and Development Joint Working Group, and technical director for cybersecurity efforts supporting presidential directed projects. Jonathan earned a bachelor's degree in computer science from Chapman University, a master's degree in information assurance from the Air Force Institute of Technology, and a doctoral degree in computer science from the University of Tulsa. Mr. Billy Rios is the co-founder of QED Secure Solutions. He is one of the world's most respected experts on emerging threats related to industrial control systems, critical infrastructure, and medical devices. He has been publicly credited by the Department of Homeland Security numerous times for his support to DHS's Industrial Control System Cyber Emergency Response Team. Billy has worked at Google, where he led the frontline response for externally reported security issues and incidents, and he also worked at Internet Explorer as the security program manager. Billy earned a bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Washington, a master's degree in information systems from Hawaii Pacific University, and an MBA from Texas A&M. Jonathan and Billy, we're happy to have you. Please proceed.
All right. Well, thank you, Rula, for that introduction. This is Jonathan. I'm going to go over some of the project motivation and goals before I hand it over to Billy to kind of round things out on our efforts here supporting the ESTCP program. From an agenda standpoint, really going to kind of dive into this building automation systems and what that means to military installations, especially from a cybersecurity perspective, and what are the unique challenges, and then kind of roll that into the basic program that ESTCP has supported us. We're actually finalizing. We're in the last few months of this project. We're going to talk about some of the results. We've gone out to 6 military installations and used BASIC to look at the configuration settings of those. We're going to get into what we're seeing as the findings across the bases, some of the things to be aware of, and some of the challenges that go along with that, and kind of diving deep into that aspect. And then we'll kind of round out the conclusions on what we found and some of the recommendations going forward. One of the interesting things that did align with our research with ESTCP is there's a National Defense Authorization Act 1650, so NDAA 1650. If you're not familiar with that and you're in this space, I'd definitely recommend looking that up. But it was a congressional act that mandated that military services go out and evaluate the cybersecurity posture of military installations. And so fortunately, our work was able to dovetail into some of the military teams that were doing NDAA 1650 efforts. And so when we were doing the evaluation of BASIC and looking at how it could actually enumerate vulnerabilities or security concerns, we were able to get that into the hands of some of those frontline assessment teams to where we could help enhance their capabilities while they were on site at the installation. So we'll get into that a little bit more. But first I want to kind of go over just the building and automation systems that we're kind of interested in. So what's interesting from building automation systems, different than what you see in traditional information technology systems like your traditional computers and business and land type aspects, is they're very disparate. So they're not common technology. So when we talk building automation systems, it's not just your HVAC. There's also lighting. There's elevator systems, access control on military installations. And a lot of these are unique technologies that are working together, and there'll be some sort of controller or integration piece to where you can actually drill down and get control over that, which is good from a usability standpoint. But these integration points often lead to potential vulnerabilities or means that a nefarious actor could actually target to try to take control of these systems. And one of the things that's different about the impacts of these systems are you can actually have physical effects through cyber means. And so that makes the game even more concerning when we talk about how do we get these things secured. And so our focus on this ESTCP effort was how do we actually look at the configurations. There's a lot of potential concerns for somebody exploiting this, but even at the lowest level, we have to make sure the systems are configured correctly. And then at that point, then we can start looking into more challenging problems. But at this point, there are some concerns with how these are configured. And what happens with what BASIC, which we can tie into, is actually also the risk management framework process, which helps baseline our security standards across military installations. So the threats to building automation systems, they're real, and they've actually been realized. We saw in the public domain, there was a New Jersey industrial control HVAC system. There was a vulnerability in some of the building automation software that was exploited, and someone was able to take control of the HVAC system in this facility and complex. We've seen ransomware distributed that's been disguised as actual updates to building automation systems. Billy was actually a part of the response team or working with the Google folks on this Australian office aspect. And what was interesting about that is Google had their building automation system was actually exposed to the internet, but it was outside their IP range. So they didn't have any awareness, even with all Google's monitoring, that their building automation system was exposed. And so we actually see that a lot, and we see that even on military installations. If you have a third-party integrator, they might use something that we don't see within either the NIPRNet or or within the DISA domain to where we can actually have awareness and view into it. So it's important that when they're configured correctly. We've seen other reports out there. DHS has a report out on how some of the vulnerabilities to building automation systems and energy installation systems. So as we look at those threats and what's been realized, we like to look at it through the lens of the Department of Defense and military installations. Some of the biggest concerns we see right now is if these building automation systems are exploited, there's some potential safety and security impacts. Some of the safety functions can be disabled. The environmental controls and conditions can actually be modified. And then we can actually see alteration of building access controls. And these are things that we've actually demonstrated through some of the assessments and actually have identified these weak points. And then once you're in that, it's interesting from a standpoint of these aspects of, is there ability to modify the control settings, but then there's also the aspect of these interconnections to some of the NIPRNet or corporate side. You can actually use that as an access point to pivot deeper into the systems. And then what we're really concerned about through the ESTCP program is the ultimate aspect of what are the impacts to mission assurance? Can we degrade military objectives? Or are there target buildings on a military installation that if you were to take down or modify, you could actually have a negative consequence on the ability to achieve mission effectiveness? And then is there a means to pivot through the building automation system to get access to other systems? So our current state of affairs, we look at what military organizations are doing to address these concerns. Right now, there's just a lack of common configuration and implementation standards when these systems are deployed, building automation systems. We've seen the whole gambit of different configurations. There's use of commercial network often are relied on to actually for control, remote control and monitoring. And then when an assessment does take place, that testing and reporting can take weeks because it's a very manual intensive process. There's not the tooling available that we see on your traditional assessment side, just because these systems are so disparate and unique. And so that's kind of what one of the things BASIC likes to do. The other aspect is just the extensive requirements for an on-site evaluation. And then when you do the evaluation, that's just a quick snapshot of that configuration at the moment. You can come back a week later and things have been changed and altered, which has opened up some potential cybersecurity weaknesses. And so that's really what we're looking at with BASIC is how can we manage this problem? What can we provide to our defenders and assessment teams to help reduce this risk case? And so at that point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Billy. He's going to talk more detail about what BASIC is and how we did that with ESTCP.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. This is Billy Rios. I'm actually going to cover some of the technical pieces as to how BASIC works and then some of the field work that we did. I think to Timothy's earlier point, there's certainly a research part to this, but what we want is the actual solution that can be used in the field. And a lot of our effort was actually focused on making sure that the end user in the fields could actually use this as a useful tool. So there were some project goals that we established at the beginning of the project. And those project goals are listed in these bullet points here. We were very focused on essentially automating and tracking items that were associated with RMF, or the risk management framework. We also wanted to make sure that folks within the DoD network could use BASIC. And so that meant things like standing up BASIC in the GovCloud, going through the ATO process, which we're going through right now, and making sure that the various services could access BASIC through things like the NIPRNet. And we also wanted to make sure that we could implement or use BASIC with no architectural changes required to the end system. And so we've been heavily involved in industrial control system security for the last 2 decades, both through the military, the DoD, other government agencies, and in the commercial world as well. And we know that being able to modify an industrial control system is a huge ask. And so what we wanted is a tool that could actually do security analysis without requiring changes to the end system, right? So we're not asking engineers to change their industrial control systems or anything like that. So we want an enterprise solution, obviously. We wanted to integrate BASIC with authority to operate procedures. So like I said, an assessor or an engineer that works for the DoD could use the service. And we wanted to generate automated reports to identify compliant/non-compliant security configuration details, right? But I think at the end of the day, when you look at all these bullets, kind of the theme or the intent, the commander's intent that we had here was essentially to answer one question. Hey, is your building automation system installed and configured securely, right? And so all of our efforts are kind of pushed towards answering that question. And so when we look at the complexity that's required to do this, what you see on this slide right here is an actual real configuration file for one of the most popular configuration systems that's deployed across the DoD. Specifically, this is a configuration file for Tritium Niagara, right? So if you were to give this file to an assessor that has no understanding of building automation systems, it's going to take some time for them to understand exactly what they're looking at here, right? So, and so what we wanted to do is essentially create an automated workflow that does automatic analysis against those configuration files. So the screenshot that you're looking at right now is actually a screen from the basic software that we wrote. It's running as a cloud service, and essentially you have this configuration analysis page, and inside of that configuration analysis page, you have the option to upload a configuration file. When you decide to upload a configuration file, there's a very easy drag and drop menu here where you select your configuration file or configuration files. You can upload multiple if you'd like. And then you essentially just drop it into the drag and drop window. And the basic backend identifies what type of configuration file it is. And that means, what vendor this came from, what version, and things like that. Automatically parses that configuration file, normalizes it, inserts the various findings into a database, and presents you a kind of easy to use menu to say, hey, look, we've done the analysis on this configuration file. If you want to look at the results of that, you can get a easy to use a page that essentially defines all the findings for this particular configuration file. And so here's an example of one of the in-application reports that we generate. All this happens within a matter of a few seconds, right? So, right now what we do is we sort what we think are the most critical issues to the top. So for example, if there's a user account that doesn't have a password, or if there's a password complexity requirement that's not being enforced, all that sort of stuff is going to get floated to the top. So if you're an assessor or if you're an engineer looking for security issues associated with your configuration file, you'll see those at the very top. And in addition to the in-application security reports that we have, we also have PDF-based reports as well. And so what this allows is if there's someone, let's say, that doesn't have access to the basic service, or if you're a facility manager and you have an integrator that's working for you deploying your facility control systems, instead of giving them access to your basic portal, you can literally just send them a PDF saying, hey, here's all the findings for this particular building automation system that you deployed. We need you to fix all this stuff here. And so, this screenshot shows you an example of the PDF report on both the left and the right-hand side. And I kind of want to talk about where we essentially use the ESTCP support to help us improve the basic program. So there are some things that aren't easily displayed in the slide, like going through the ATO process, getting the basic backend services deployed into the GovCloud, working with various assessment teams. But here's some really tangible examples of how the ESTCP program essentially pushed basic to the next level. And so the screenshots that we went over essentially is the old front-end interface for basic. And what you're looking at here is the new front-end for basic that's running in the GovCloud. So there's a lot more holistic reporting for building automation systems. There's a concept of teams here. So if you are a manager that runs 5 or 6 engineers for a team, you can have those engineers or assessors uploading configuration files, and you as a team manager can have a holistic view of all the configuration files that are being uploaded to your team portal. If you look at the screenshot on the bottom right-hand side, you can see an overall risk distribution as far as all the findings for your particular team, what percentage are rated critical, what percentage are rated high, medium, and low. We also sort by vendor. So if you're using multiple vendors, like let's say you're using Tritium and Automated Logic and Siemens, we can also break down, which vendors have the most findings and which vendors have the most critical findings and things like this. And so essentially what we've done based on the ESTCP report is take basic from an individual tool where an individual is uploading things and an individual is getting an individual report to something that can be managed as a team. And this is based on direct feedback that we got from various assessment teams that were using basic throughout the ESTCP project. And so when we talk about some of the supported efforts that we did, like Timothy mentioned before, there is a research aspect to this, but we were very cognizant of making sure that the end user in the field could find BASIC as a useful tool. And so part of our supported efforts that were outlined in our BASIC project were evaluating this at actual real military installations in support of real assessment teams and in support of real engineers, right? And so through the ESTCP report, we were able to evaluate 6 different military installations. We had 4 different major vendors. That's Tritium Niagara, ALC, Siemens Apogee, and also Johnson Controls Metasys. And so through the assessment teams on 1650, we've identified literally hundreds of misconfiguration vulnerabilities. We're also able to provide some training to the various assessment team members, and this gave us some really good data as far as the efficiencies that BASIC is realizing. So, for example, when we went through the training, we manually trained various assessors on how to do building automation configuration analysis manually. And what we've discovered is that for a mission-ready or combat mission-ready assessor, so that means an assessor that's gone through the DoD cyber operator pipelines, it takes them anywhere from 8 to 16 hours to kind of go through the initial building automation control configuration analysis courseware. And then once they have that 16 hours of training, it takes anywhere from 8 to 32 hours for them to do the actual analysis on a configuration file. So if they're given a single configuration file, it's going to take anywhere from a day to almost a week. And then once that's done, they obviously have the reporting piece. And so we were able to compress, that hourly requirement anywhere from around 24 hours to almost 40 hours, all the way down to just a matter of seconds to generate a report. And then also for folks that don't have the training to be a combat mission-ready cyber operator in the DoD, they don't need that with BASIC, right? Because all the back end takes care of understanding how building automation system configuration files are structured and things like that, right? So, in all total, through the ESTCP program, we trained about 150 active duty assessors. That includes Guard and civilians. There are students from Army, Air Force, the Navy, the New Space Force, Army Corps of Engineers, and essentially all the major cyber operation centers for all the major services. And most of the work that we did here was provided through the NDAA 1650 effort and through RMF compliance as well. Some of the observations that we had, some of the big things that we saw, a lot of the building automation systems that we're looking at do utilize default configurations. That can be a problem for a variety of people. A lot of weak and default passwords, considering that building automation systems typically don't provide a mechanism to do centralized user management or password control. Unpatched systems, essentially running an outdated version of a building control system. We did find a handful of systems that were exposed to the internet. When we say internet exposure, this is specifically for DoD systems that were exposed onto the internet. 100% of the systems that we looked at had some type of improper permissions or user permission set. A lot of folks are kind of abusing the admin/super user privilege and just assigning that to all their users. Common configurations, and so what we were able to do is essentially compare configuration files for various configs that were uploaded by team members and see where differences are. It seems that like once an engineering team settles on a configuration, that common configuration is deployed to lots of different building automation systems. And then in 100% of the systems that we looked at in support of NDA 1650, we saw at least one, RMF control that wasn't met, right? So lots of implications on this. I can't get into specific implications for the support that we gave to the assessment teams, but I think some of the bullets here kind of lead folks to understand what the potential implications could be, considering that these are DoD facilities. Depending on what the facility is supporting, what type of mission they're supporting, or what type of weapon system they're supporting, there could be some pretty serious implications here. And then some of the updates that we have. So like I said before, to train an operator and then to have them go through the manual process of evaluating a configuration file, it's going to take anywhere from 8 hours to 40 hours to kind of go through the entire cycle. We cut that down into seconds now, right? So the efficiency that you gain there is pretty significant. In addition to that, because it's an automated system, you can't overwhelm the cloud service that we have because it can scale up to the amount of configuration files that you want to implement, right? So I think it would be unreasonable to take a an assessment team and say, hey, we need you to look at 5,000 configuration files over the next 2 weeks. They literally don't have enough hours to do that, right, or manpower to do that. With an automated system like BASIC, you could submit thousands or tens of thousands of configuration files over the matter of a couple of days, right? So get reports back and have holistic reporting on all those configuration files within a matter of minutes. So we have done multiple installations. We implemented support for an additional vendor here based on feedback that we got from one of the assessment teams. But one of the things that we're very proud of is, as anyone that's been on the kind of brunt end of a cybersecurity assessment, a lot of times the findings and reporting kind of depends on the skill level of the assessor conducting the assessment. With an automated backend like BASIC, we get consistency in kind of the finding and reporting of the configuration files, right? So there is no variance in that. Maybe one day you get an expert assessor as opposed to a journeyman assessor. Maybe the assessor is overwhelmed with other tasks that they have to take care of. When you have an automated backend system like this, the findings are very, very consistent because the analysis is done in an automated fashion, right? We're currently going through the GovCloud ATO. We do have an instance that stood up on the GovCloud right now. We piloted both the Amazon GovCloud and the Microsoft GovCloud and essentially baked the two different technologies against each other, baked off the two different technologies against each other. We've decided on which cloud provider that we want to use, and we have our entire cloud stack already deployed in the GovCloud. We're going through the ATO process as we speak right now. That's one of the last tasks that we have for the ESTCP program. And once that's done, this will be a service that can be available as a cloud service to every DoD user through the GovCloud with an actual real ATO. If you're an assessment team and you need this capability sooner rather than later, we do have kind of a standalone capability that we can use for assessment teams and things like that, but we're really kind of doing the big push to make sure that this is an enterprise solution that can be used across the DoD. And that brings us to our conclusion slides here. We can help the DoD realize a lot of efficiency here when it comes to automated building automation configuration analysis. This is going to provide you a very consistent level of analysis, and it's going to reduce the load that's associated with these various assessment teams doing these building automation control assessments, right? And then once this thing is ready for GovCloud, I think we're going to have a lot of impact here on the assessment teams and what they're doing. So.
Yeah, and this is Jonathan again. Saw a couple questions going by, so wanted to at least kind of answer some of those questions here in a couple minutes we have remaining on our time. One aspect was the NDA 1650, if you're searching for that. It was the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act for the year, if you're Googling and looking for that. Another question that we noticed was the training that's actually through Idaho National Lab. So if you go through to their website, probably the easiest way is just to Google INL, Critical Infrastructure Protection Training, our Cyber. It was sponsored in association with Army Cyber Corps. So their website is inl.gov/critical-infrastructure, and we can get that to Timothy for later disbursement. But really, again, if you just Google INL and our Cyber. So those were kind of some of the initial ones we saw going through. So at that time, we will move on and pass this along. I think we're going to have time for more questions at the end, so we'll go ahead and pass it along to Colin for the next presentation.
Actually, we're going to go ahead and take a break and answer some of the additional questions that came through. But as a reminder, before we do that, for additional information on this project, you can go to the SERDP and ESTCP webpage that's dedicated to this. And also as a reminder, you can download the slides from the webinar webpage for this particular webinar. So a PDF of the slides is available. A video, YouTube video will also be posted in about a few days. And then any reports can be downloaded from Jonathan and Billy's project website. So with that, we're going to go ahead and transition. We're right on time. So we're going to go ahead and transition to some questions that have been coming through. Thank you, Jonathan, for taking the initiative to answer some of them. We have one from the Navy, a question from the Navy about how you have gone about prioritizing your findings. So, Jonathan, would you like to respond and then pass it on to Billy for any additional thoughts?
Yeah, this is Jonathan. Thanks for that question. It's a great question. So we map actually to the 8500 and also with the NIST framework. So what's interesting about that is the findings we get, that's how we're mapping it, but we're trying to define them through the RMF process. So when we see there's an admin administrator account with no password, we can pretty readily map that through for the DoD into a critical finding. We also map it into a lot of the vendors, like Tritium has their own security guidance, and they rank it for us. So we map it into that, but that's one of the things that we're kind of working with some of the organizations is how do we define as critical, moderate, and easy. And Billy, I'll let you kind of piggyback.
Yeah, and in addition to that, this is Billy. One of the things that we're actually pretty proud of is through the ESTCP project, one of the assessment teams actually asked us for essentially the ability to deploy custom rankings essentially for findings. And so what we've already implemented is a separate page that literally lists all the findings for particular vendors. And if you're interested in, ignoring certain findings, or if you're interested in raising the severity for certain findings, the assessment team can actually do that for their particular assessment team. And so, our default mechanism is, NIST 8500 and RMF, related, but that doesn't stop any assessment team from essentially implementing their own risk rating for particular findings. And so we have some flexibility there.
Great, thank you so much. Billy, this is another follow-on question from the Navy relating to the format of the configuration file. So what format do the configuration files need to be in?
That's very vendor specific. We're trying to make that as flexible as possible. So if you're for the engineers on the presentation, for say for Tritium Niagara, we'll consume a BOG file, we'll consume a file.xml file, so any format essentially you want to upload, we'll be able to deal with it. For things like automated logic, there's essentially a specific format that we need the database to be exported into, but we have tools and scripts that kind of do that. For the Johnson Control Metasys, there's a couple different files that are used there as well. We'll take any format, whether it's the compressed version, the uncompressed version, the XML version. We can deal with all of that on the back end. You don't even have to specify. We'll automatically detect it on the back end. And then for the Siemens Apogee, essentially there's a set of scripts that we have that normalizes the data into a way that BASIC can consume that. But the kind of neat thing about this is that the analysis engine is actually different from the parsing engine. And so if we're working with the team that says, hey, I kind of don't want to, or I want to submit it in this specific format, we can actually just add that as a parser for our front end, and basically have the parsing done, gets normalized, put into the database, and then the findings engine, the analysis engine, gets run on the decompressed / normalized version of the configuration file. So we have those pieces separate. That allows us to kind of scale to new technologies as they arise, new file formats and new formats for configuration files.
Great, thank you, Billy. This is a question maybe that Jonathan can take a first crack at. Can you explain again how BASIC is used to meet the requirements of the DoD RMF? Is it used for initial ATO approval or for ongoing maintenance?
Yeah, and thanks for that. And so initially what we're looking at using this for, integrating it with for the RMF, is that initial controls and identifying what configuration requirements need to be met, and then that report going into your RMF package so it shows you're actually clear and green. One of the future considerations for BASIC is looking at the continual monitoring aspect of it, to where there's actually an agent that's actually pulling this information on a reoccurring basis to get that continuous monitoring aspect to show, hey, your configuration changed. Do you accept that? Do you not? Does it modify your RMF requirements from that perspective? So the initial part for RMF is actually on the initial certification. And then once you get that report and use that, the long-term plan is to do that for continual monitoring.
Great, thank you. Okay, another question has to do with whether you've looked at switchgear and generator industrial control systems. Billy, maybe you could respond to this question.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of interest in that. Some of the NDAA 1650 teams, they were not specifically tasked to look at building automation systems, but critical infrastructure. And they asked us to do that. However, the back end actually supports all of this already, right? It's modularized. As long as we can get an example of a configuration file from whatever system that you want, whether it's a traditional ICS SCADA like a generator or power plant, or a rebreaker or anything like that, all the way to IoT. We can do IoT configuration. The back end and the parsing engine all support that. We just need to go through it one time, get a good configuration file, figure out how it's done, normalize it, and then get a set of findings that we want to identify against it. The ESTCP project wasn't, the scope of it wasn't that. We wanted to keep it focused on building automation systems. And so the ESTCP work we did was for building automation systems specifically, or HVAC systems, control systems, facility control systems. But there's certainly nothing stopping us from implementing ICS or SCADA-related configuration, automated configuration analysis. You can essentially do this on any type of embedded device you want.
Thank you so much. This is a question from the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. Are you assessing controls for microgrid infrastructure?
That's not currently implemented, but we could implement that in a pretty straightforward manner. I wish we could go into a little bit more detail as far as like the technical stack that BASIC is built on, but essentially what we've done is normalized into kind of 3 different phases, right? There's a parsing phase where you provide a configuration file. Our automated logic automatically identifies what type of configuration file it is, parses it. There's a normalization phase here that takes that parse data, normalizes it, the data into a structure that BASIC can consume. And then there's a storage analysis piece where once it's normalized and stored, we can actually do analysis on that. And so that allows us to scale to essentially any type of configuration file that's out there. It doesn't have to be building automation related. If you're interested in controllers or microgrid equipment, traditional SCADA, it should work on all those types of systems. The ESTCP project was focused more on kind of building control systems, environmental control systems, but there's nothing stopping BASIC from consuming other types of configuration files and providing a similar report.
Great, thank you. All right, maybe Jonathan, you can respond to this one. How well does BASIC scale to multiple installations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we first started this, that's one of the things we wanted to look at is the scalability of it. Part of that was getting it into the DoD GovCloud and getting aspect on that for scalability. From this point, we've been able to scale through thousands of devices without any negative impact on the processing. One of the nice things, what we're looking at on that is how do we drill down? What part can we provide a holistic view to where senior leadership perhaps can drill down into the various installations, can look at the findings, can get individual down to the building itself. So if you look at an installation commander, maybe they're more concerned about certain buildings because of their mission set and the reliance on that. And they want to have monitoring of that and make sure that's aware. So one of the things that we're looking to expand on actually is that component. So we know the technical capabilities to expand BASIC scale well. We're looking at maybe the overlay into the drill down perspective, and we're actually working with potential NAVFAC and MCICOM to actually implement that across their installations so that they can drill down. And that's some future research we're looking at.
Yeah, this is Billy. I just want to add one thing to this. So, as opposed to a traditional assessor doing this manually, we've already measured like thousands of % efficiency over a traditional manual assessment. And the technology on the back end, since it's running in the GovCloud, this is why we're so insistent on getting it running in the GovCloud. The technology piece of this, it'll scale to as high as you want it to scale, right? So if you want to do continuous monitoring of a building automation system or a fleet of building automation systems across an entire installation or even across an entire region, and you want to do that every minute, the back-end technology supports assessment capabilities like that. Right, and so that's one of the reasons why we're so insistent in getting this working in the GovCloud. We have this already working as kind of an individual standalone system where an individual assessor can get their needs met by getting reports and things like that. But we want this to be able to scale to the point where we can literally handle every facility in the DoD right? Doing continuous monitoring in a matter of minutes, right? So submitting configuration file every minute and be able to do analysis on them.
Thank you, Billy. And another question, maybe you can start with that one. This is from the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center. How would you deal with a finding that maps to a control that could be NA?
So
from a NIST 882 Appendix G ICS overlay.
So I'm going to just walk through findings real quick. So, Jonathan and I and our team, we actually have a lot of experience doing manual assessments, red teams against embedded devices and HVAC systems, both for DoD and commercial. One of the things that we're very careful of is we don't want to, we want to identify a finding basically just purely on technical identification. What we don't want to do is associate it with an impact to mission or associate it with system. And so, because that changes the way we have to store it and dramatically. So, essentially what we have is we have technical criteria that identifies finding. For example, this user has no password. And we just identified that. We don't say, hey, this is a critical system. We don't say this impacts your mission in this way. And so as long as there's a technical description of the finding that you're interested in, we can put that into basic. And it can be anything that you want, right? So as long as you can define it in a technical manner. And so currently what we have it mapped towards is NIST standards, and we have some things that are from the vendor. Those are technical descriptions of what the findings are. But if you're interested in a very specific type of finding or a very specific symptom for a particular finding, we can implement that no problem. What we can't do, however, or what we're unwilling to do at this point is essentially tie a finding to mission impact or tie a finding to system. So that's kind of a line that we're not going to cross. But from a technical standpoint, if you can technically describe the finding, we can identify it inside of the configuration file.
Thank you so much. And one last quick question before we wrap up. We got more questions than we can answer in this short Q&A. We'll try to get back to some of them towards the end. But as a reminder, please feel free to reach out to the speakers directly. You've got their phone numbers and their email addresses. But one last question that we're going to ask you came from the Navy. And it has to do with how often are you updating policies such as latest patch versions from vendors? So Billy, do you want to? Okay.
Yeah,
Billy
it's a really good question. This is Billy. So, so for the standalone instances, updating is actually a challenge. So we have to be able to get the updated analysis engine to the individual assessment teams. They're typically running it in a VM on their assessment platform that's not network connected, so there's lots of hoops that we have to run through. For the cloud service, we update the analysis engine as soon as new information is available. It's just that simple, right? So, and once again, that's why we have a big push here to get everything running in the GovCloud and get away from kind of the standalone assessment model. And so there's kind of two different ways we're approaching updates. One is a little bit more slower, just due to the necessary requirements of getting updates to assessment teams, and one is really quick as we push it to the cloud, and everyone benefits from the update instantaneously.
Great. Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. And at this point, we're going to transition to our last presentation for today, which is going to be given by Mr. Colin Dunn. Colin is the CEO and founder of Fend Incorporated in Arlington, Virginia. Prior to his role at Fend, Colin worked as a design engineer, manager, and consultant for 15 years, helping teams bring products to market to improve the resilience of our built environment. Colin is a professional engineer, lead accredited professional, and certified energy manager. He earned a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Virginia and an MBA from Penn State. Colin, please proceed.
All right, well, thank you, Rula. And thank you, Jonathan and Billy, for that great presentation. I think it ties well into this discussion around physical cybersecurity And by that I mean the concept of using data diodes to bring equipment status and other information to remote SCADA systems, to the cloud, and how this technology, which has been around for some time, in one form or another, has really advanced quite a bit over the last few years. And we'll tell you about how this is being applied and evaluated through this ESTCP project. So as part of this presentation, we'll talk a bit about some of the risks and benefits of connecting infrastructure to the cloud or to a remote system for monitoring. We'll discuss data diodes in depth and how they should be seen as a tool for facility managers today. We'll talk about the particulars of this ESTCP project and some of the benefits to DoD of deploying this technology. As we take a step back and talk not just about the cybersecurity technology, but about what are we trying to do with it, the goal is really to know what is happening in real time with that connected infrastructure that serves the hundreds of thousands of buildings across DoD, as well as millions of additional pieces of industrial equipment across the defense industrial base and beyond into the commercial sector. And so much of this legacy equipment was designed at times to really operate autonomously, to work on its controls and set points, respond to differences in temperature, and it's very happy to continue to operate. But it also is desirable by our facility managers and our installation commanders to know what this equipment is doing in real time, and to be able to monitor this equipment remotely means that we can then do things like use the power of predictive analytics to determine when a piece of equipment might be about to fail, or when perhaps equipment doesn't need service right now. We can make the best use of our really limited manpower. There's never enough maintenance teams to go around, and it's hard enough to keep up with the things that are catching on fire, let alone chipping away at that deferred maintenance backlog. So if we can bring this equipment into a remote monitoring setting and know what it's doing in real time, we have the opportunity to improve operational efficiency, both in terms of energy and water and labor. We can reduce business interruption and disruption to mission by knowing that a piece of equipment might be about to fail in hours or days. There's also an opportunity to make better engineering decisions than just, oh my goodness, that motor failed. What, do you have one just like it, plop it back in? But rather, hey, we have probably a few weeks left on this system. Perhaps we can go for a higher efficiency system, and then we'll have that better efficiency for the next 10 years or however long that equipment lasts. And you can get this information without having to drive around in the truck and check on equipment. It's very often disconnected or air gapped. And you can really have the right person with the right tool at the right site at the right time with the power of remote monitoring. As Jonathan mentioned, there's a lot of risk, though, connecting this equipment either to a larger network or to the internet. There's the opportunity to steal data and inject ransomware. And as some of the data that Jonathan showed, there are often connections directly to the internet, even though they were not intended to be so. And that's true of DoD facilities and beyond, where these industrial control systems can be the back door for attackers to steal information to potentially related to those systems, or even if there's a bridge over to the IT systems, and to do harm that way. But also, the thing that really worried me the most and what got me into the business here is the ability of those attackers to modify or destroy equipment. And that means that lives are on the line. This is not just going to a backup copy of data now. This is disrupting the critical infrastructure that brings clean water and energy to the buildings across DoD so that we can achieve our mission. We've had a variety of tools and techniques, and no one of these is going to solve every problem across IT and operational technology or OT infrastructure. But in terms of some of the findings that Jonathan talked about, with the people abusing the admin privileges and not having the right permissions, there are certainly human elements that need to be addressed, such as better policies and training. You've probably taken your annual "don't click on that" training, but still folks are vulnerable to really enticing messages or even social engineering that might take advantage of somebody's credentials. The credentials may be legitimate, but fall into the wrong hands. And there are some systems that are just so critical you think sometimes perhaps you should not be giving folks remote access to some of these systems. And a lot of them don't have that. And we'll talk about the air gaps in a moment. But I do want to bring up cyber insurance. And this is more common in retail space and other situations where you might have customer information or personally identifiable information, that the worry there is that you might have a big public relations nightmare, or you might have to pay for somebody's 15th subscription to a credit monitoring service. Those are okay, perhaps. They're certainly not as good as protecting in the first place. But I bring it up because I've talked to folks in the utility space, water utilities, for example, that think they can still insure away the problem of cybersecurity. But we're talking about infrastructure that determines how much of a chemical is going into the water supply, that is determining how hot or cold refrigerated medicine or blood supplies need to be. So this is far more critical when we're talking about the built environment here than we can just insure away. There's also air gaps, cutting the cord. This is certainly how we did things for a very long time, but it takes a lot of manpower to know what equipment is doing, checking on equipment or waiting for someone to call because service has been disrupted, space is too hot, or there's flooding from above. And though there might be a temptation to use air gaps as the solution to cybersecurity, there's a few issues with air gaps that don't make it quite as secure as you would think. One, there are technologies that can actually exploit air gaps, and there's a whole set of sessions that could be just about that, to steal information and do other things, to extract information from systems that would otherwise be thought to be disconnected. But there's also the human element again, and you'll see folks trying to make their job easier or more efficient if you ask them, and their job might be to go get some information, and it would be so much faster if I just carried a thumb drive over there and I wouldn't have to write all this down, or even, hey, I'm just going to connect up an Ethernet cable just for a little bit. There's folks on the human side that make an air gap not quite as secure as it sounds. There's also dedicated fiber, running its own line but among your operational technology systems, completely separate from the IT systems. And this works as long as it's actually maintained in that state. But over time, you find that those segmentation can, without continuous monitoring, find their way to be connected to each other, perhaps by accident, perhaps maliciously. But also dedicated fiber gets to be very expensive over very large distances, and you might find on the military installation, many square miles. There could be a very large distance between different facilities. So it gets to be expensive and not completely secure, if not monitored for other breaches. And then there's firewalls and software and cloud-based threat detection. And I'm going to lump all these together as just software, because firewalls are just pieces of hardware that run software. But the basic premise of these is that they're going to let the good traffic in and they're going to keep the bad traffic out. And they know what's good and what's bad based on a set of patches and updates that are always preparing you for yesterday's war. They're not preparing you for what's happening right now or the unknown of tomorrow. And as Jonathan mentioned, a lot of these operational technology systems are not getting the patches in the first place. So these are pretty good solutions generally from the IT space, and they keep out most threats. But the consequences of that 1% or that 5% chance of something happening are so great with our critical infrastructure, with the building systems where the mission happens, where people are housed, that we need to have another tool for the toolbox. And that's where this ESTCP project explores the use of data diodes to extract data from building automation systems and other pieces of equipment in such a way that it makes it not possible to hack in through the network connection. And I'll talk more about how that happens, but it's really a physics-based approach. And it's an approach that I appreciate as a mechanical engineer. I really like concrete, things you can see, things that are physically moving, air or water. And when I started this venture here, I thought there must be some other physics-based way to send data in only one direction rather than relying on software. And it turns out that there's actually been a category of devices that do this for some time now called data diodes. Data diodes are hardware appliances used to send data physically in only one direction. You might find one of these at a nuclear power plant or in the intelligence community, but also increasingly, high-end utility work like water utilities, as well as refineries and other infrastructure that really you cannot afford to let a single bit get in. You can't let a single malicious packet reach that equipment because the consequences are so dire if somebody's able to control it or destroy it. Now, the way this technology works is that you'll have some form of isolation, typically optical, where you're turning a stream of data into light, which is shined a short distance, sometimes through fiber optic equipment, and then assembled into a data stream to be sent back off to an IT network, for example. But these devices have light that really only shines in one direction. There's no physical element in the hardware that can shine light back in. So it's as though you were trying to shine Morse code to somebody on another hillside. If you had a flashlight but they didn't, they wouldn't have a way to send a message back to you. And that's how a data diode works. It's using light to send data in only one direction. Now, this physically enforced one-way data flow is of great benefit to these systems where you want to get data out of them, where you need to move information from one place to another, but you can't let it go back in. And on the IT side, you'll see this for moving data into or out of a SCIF, for example, where you really cannot allow any data to backflow. And by not allowing somebody to hack through the network connection, it makes it very secure. And that's why there's a fairly small but loyal following of this technology in spaces like utilities and within DoD. However, if we are trying to deploy this technology at the tens of thousands of applicable buildings across DoD, then the generator sets and the microgrids and other major pieces of equipment, there's some challenges, including the fact that this equipment is often oversized for the industrial controls market. These devices were really got their start trying to send large volumes of data, and at times this can be 10 gigabits per second. But if you're getting 10 gigabits per second out of Modbus or BACnet out of a building, I'd like to see what kind of building that is, because generally these systems you can keep track of with a dial-up modem. And so they're oversized, and that helps make them a very expensive option. And high cost is really the next big hurdle, is that it's very frequent that a data diode will cost over $100,000 per device. And though it's very important to protect our buildings, $100,000 times hundreds of thousands of buildings really does add up. And these devices can easily be over $250,000 each. So they're expensive, they're oversized. They also have been traditionally complex to install with a lot of custom software and firmware by trained network engineers that need to come in and commission it. And you also have limited producers in the US who make these devices. So it's a really great concept of sending data in physically only one direction, but with some perhaps business model challenges and otherwise that have made it limited until now. But the concept itself of sending data using light in only one direction is so compelling that it deserved another look. And that's why there's a new generation of data diodes that are coming to market now that take this concept of optical isolation, of sending data using light in only one direction, and really making it more of a mass market item, something you could afford to put on a building automation system or a generator set. Not necessarily something you would put on every single sensor in a building, but one where you might take the performance data of a building and then send it elsewhere at the military installation or even to the cloud. This next generation of data diodes has some other things that make it more suitable for these industrial applications, including low cost. Rather than something that typically would start at $50,000, these are less than a tenth of that, so much more affordable for a building level monitoring. They don't require the patches and updates that firewalls do to keep you safe. And they no longer require you to have servers that are there to collect data, and one to be trained only to speak and one to be trained only to talk. This all happens within a small device about the size of your fist. And these are really ideal for the industrial Internet of Things, bringing this equipment into a remote monitoring setting, letting operators know what's happening, but not allowing attackers any physical way to hack into those systems. Allows us to then bring large volumes of building automation systems and others into remote monitoring environments and really prioritize where to spend maintenance folks' time. These newer devices have serial Ethernet and other even wireless connections to allow for a variety of different equipment types, including newer equipment that might have an Ethernet port, but also older programmable logic controllers. From the 1970s and 80s, you can use a screwdriver and pull information out and send it through the diode, where it is then optically isolated, encrypted, and sent off to where it needs to go. The installation is straightforward. It's designed to work with common machine protocols like BACnet and Modbus, things that you'll see across tens of thousands of buildings. And now it really becomes more practical to bring this equipment into a remote monitoring setting because there's not a physical way to hack through this network connection due to this data diode technology. Now, to encourage the distribution of this equipment across DoD and beyond, this ESTCP project seeks to demonstrate that these claims of being able to fully isolate this equipment and that it is interoperable with different equipment types, speaking machine protocols, and something that can really work in a variety of manufacturers and systems, those are big parts of this project. Also, to prove that it is easy to install, even if the device itself is fairly low cost, you don't want to have a huge installation and commissioning bill that goes along with it. Just keep the total cost of ownership low. And throughout the course of this project, if any modifications were needed to the hardware itself, that those additions or changes did not add significantly to the cost. So being able to demonstrate these is in 3 key steps of the project that I'll talk about in just a moment. The focus of this project is also on the use case of remote monitoring for building automation systems. You can do other things with data diodes, like become the bridge between an OT and an IT system. For example, a water treatment plant, you might want to send the performance data off to the engineering team or off to even regulators and auditors without giving them access to the original set of data, but rather making sure that that information is protected from the outside world. It also can prevent you needing to burn CDs and carry it across the room or put things on a hard drive and ship it. There's that opportunity to do direct connection. And you can also use it for database replication. We talked a bit about streaming data, Modbus and BACnet and other protocols, but you can also use this to copy files and send files in a one-way fashion. So the 3 main steps of this project are compatibility tests, penetration tests, and long-term reliability tests. And the first of these is to confirm that this new class of diode can communicate with different types of equipment and different protocols that are found across DoD. And some of the most common of these are BACnet, Modbus, and LAN, but also increasingly common just using FTP for file transfer. The latter of these, you'll see use cases like a energy savings performance contract. There would be an M&V component of that, a measurement and verification component of that. And if this data from many different buildings was stored on a local hard drive, that hard drive might before be shipped to another location for analysis. But if you could use a diode to get this information in real time, you could avoid the expense of the hard drives, of the shipping, of potentially somebody coming out and picking up that data. And you can get that data at times months faster than having to wait to fill up the drive and send it off to where it needs to go. Rather, you can make changes to the operation in near real time and further improve the efficiency of these systems under that ESPC. So if the data is collected in a CSV or a text file or some other file, sending it across the FTP is something that you can do as well. So we're working with the Army Corps of Engineers Construction Engineering Research Lab and set up a sample network at SERL where we have a variety of different level 1, 2, and 3 devices, as well as a connection to a remote server at level 4, and making sure that the data is not only able to be passed through these devices and that it's able to connect to a variety of different types, but also that the data is reliable and is of the same quality as though the diode weren't there at all. So this compatibility test is the first major part. The second part of that is penetration tests. So if these formerly $100,000 devices, these incumbent data diodes, provided full optical isolation, is that still true at a device that costs less than a 20th of that? And so a big piece of this is to prove that through a red team test. And we've been working with the Threat Systems Management Office, or TSMO, at Redstone Arsenal, who's been working to test this device, see if they can penetrate it. Can they send data upstream? Can they also disrupt or disable the device? It's one thing to keep the attackers out, but if the attacker is able to disrupt the hardware, then it is not as useful if it's no longer speaking. So doing things like denial of service attacks, but also some other creative side channel attacks and things like that, to make sure that this is a full optical isolation device, keeping hackers out entirely. And so that testing is underway, and the third part of this is about to begin, and that's field tests. And so really the important data that comes from the compatibility tests and the penetration tests should really prove that those risks are off the table for deploying these widely. And then the next big piece of this is to prove that this is equipment that's going to have a long life, and it's been designed to last 10 years or longer, like the equipment that it serves. There's often decades old mechanical systems, and we're hoping that one day, 20 years from now, you're going to see data diodes that were installed in 2020 and 2021. They're plugging along with it because that's the reality of these systems. They're going to run until they break, and then they're going to get replaced, but they're going to run a very long time. So to prove that over the course of many months to start, we're working with Searle, and there's a couple of buildings in Champaign, Illinois, where we are hooking these up at the end of this summer to run continuously and to send data to another location to make sure that it continues to operate across a variety of different temperature conditions and largely over the course of time, just to make sure that it continues to be reliable. We're also working to have additional test sites and additional use cases to further expand the tech transferability, because there are many different types of facilities across Department of Defense, and if you have a site that you would like to be a part of this, please reach out, because we are working with all of the services to get some at different parts of the country, as well as different use cases, different building types. So with widespread deployment of these low-cost data diodes to physically protect the systems but extract the data, there's lots of benefits to the Department of Defense, including increased access to building performance data. Those systems that may have been living with an air gap today, or with an occasional download of a static point in time of how those systems are performing, being able to get this in real time is a great benefit to facility managers and installation commanders. It also allows for streams of data that may not have been able to be combined before to provide an even greater picture of operational efficiency. And that potentially can be using the power of AI and machine learning in the cloud to combine data from building automation systems, from chiller plants, from generator sets, even from badge readers and other sets of data that might not have obvious connections. But if all of these are able to contribute to a data set while still being isolated from each other, there's some really interesting things you can do with that big data opportunity. There's also the opportunity with the deployment of data diodes to help with compliance for cybersecurity requirements. If there is a point in the network through which nothing else can pass, there should be an ability to streamline some of those requirements there. And it is my goal as well, not just to improve the operational efficiency across DoD, but to see what we can do to lighten the burden of the RMF process. If we can make it such that having a diode in the network means that a whole bunch of things are no longer a threat, and we can save people, plenty of time that they can be doing other things. There's also the improved operational efficiency, both in terms of energy and water efficiency, but also of manpower, as we discussed. And that's often, you'll have just not enough people running around trying to fix things. And it's also a challenging set of folks to train, and getting really good facility managers takes a long time. And as we continue to have a workforce that that is going to need ongoing continuing education and all that, the more we invest in our people, the more we need to get really good at using them efficiently. So let's make sure that every minute of their day counts and that they are being in the right place with the right tool at the right time. So getting all this information allows us to supplement manpower with data. So to review, we talked a bit about how remote monitoring of legacy equipment is a really powerful tool, but only when it's deployed securely, and how data diodes can provide that layer of physical cybersecurity so that you no longer have to worry about the patches and updates or the slim chance that somebody might get through a completely up-to-date system. This takes that threat off the table. There's also now, with the way that this technology is moving, both in terms of capabilities and price point, that even on a cost basis, data diodes are becoming cost competitive with commercial and industrial firewalls. And one day, hopefully, down on par with things like IoT gateways. And so certainly if you have heard of data diodes before and you thought that they were too complex or expensive, that the market is rapidly changing. And finally, the benefits with wide deployment include operational resilience and energy efficiency. So with that, I'd like to invite you to ask any questions through the Q&A window, and my contact information is here. And thanks again to you all for your time today, and thank you to the ESTCP team for allowing us to be part of this program.
Great. Thank you so much, Colin, for another great presentation. We've received a number of questions for you, and this is one from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Are there any low-cost data diodes that are accredited for use by the DoD?
So there's a few different accreditation programs out there. You know, there's Savvy certified. There's also other lists, you know, like the Control Systems Trusted Product list. And you know, one of the things that we're doing through this project is evaluating, you know, which of those paths is the most efficient for our technology, but also doing things like the red team as well, making sure that that sort of report is available to the folks that might need it. In terms of the certifications, you know, there are other providers out there. I'm not sure that it's really easy to parse out whether they're accredited products are their high-end or their low-end products in terms of price, but certainly the other providers are looking at this category as well as something that doesn't necessarily need to be astronomically expensive. In terms of if there's a specific certification that you're looking for, I'm happy to talk afterwards. You know, some of these processes need a sponsor to go through, and I'm sure that we'd be able to work with you on that.
Great, thank you. Here's a question from the Navy. Have you worked with NSA regarding the security of the data diode devices?
So that's related to the previous question in terms of, you know, having these certified and tested. And that's one where, you know, again, we're working with the team at TSMO. The results of that ought to inform anybody at NSA. We're certainly happy, even as part of this project perhaps, to go through that sort of test with NSA. Again, we don't have the contact info of the right person to speak there, but certainly, you know, I think that we'd be able to pass any such evaluation.
Thank you, Colin. This is a question related to the cost. What is the cost of new data diode services compared to any previous ones that could be in use? And also, when you start talking about application, how many vendors can actually perform these services?
So, you know, the cost, still today you'll hear about some astronomically high bids that go out there. You know, some as high as $370,000 per diode, but that's in some really, again, very high-end applications, very high data throughput. And so choosing along the lines of things where we're talking more about the megabit scale of data throughput rather than the gigabit scale allows for those costs to come down. You know, the technology is creeping well under $5,000 per device, and I anticipate it going far lower than that. And there may also be some other bundling of product and service that allows the hardware cost to be very low. In terms of providers, and we're not the only ones who are looking at it that way. Certainly, I think this is a category of devices that's going to find its way all across commercial real estate, healthcare, and beyond. So it's going to have a lot of competition, keeping prices low. There are some other providers out there that you'll see across the U.S. market, including some domestic and foreign producers, including BAE Systems, OWL, and Waterfall. So there are a few you can now get 3 bids on these things, and certainly happy to answer any additional questions on that topic.
Thank you, Colin. This is a question from Buyang Wang, University of Cincinnati. How can encryption keys be exchanged and updated when there is only one-way traffic due to the use of data diodes?
So depending on at what point you want to encrypt, you can be encrypting data upstream of the diode, or you can be encrypting data downstream of the diode. I'd say that there are some different techniques there. I don't necessarily want to go into the specifics of how we do it. I think that's probably a separate conversation. But there is the opportunity to pass data that is either previously encrypted or encrypted on the outbound side of a diode transaction.
Thank you so much. And this is a question from Closed Loop Communications. How do you handle publish, subscribe, and master slave protocols? Is it stored and forwarded? And how are you capturing the tags, registers, and coils that might be queried from a master to slaves on opposite sides of the diode?
So we take an approach that really any information that could ever be asked of a piece of equipment is something that should be gathered on regular intervals. You may not be able to ask a question from the outside, but if there are hundreds or even thousands of registers, again, the volumes of data are not so high that you couldn't just get the status of that at regular intervals and then pass it across the diode. So where there are those situations with a system that is set up and commissioned, those registers aren't likely to change. If you have a full register list, you can have that pre-programmed into either a device that's diode's talking to or on the diode itself.
Great, thank you, Colin. I'd like to just shift gears a little bit and transition to broader questions, and this is from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and we'll start with you, Colin, and then move on to Jonathan and Billy for their input. But has your work and your findings been reported for strategic enterprise trends, trends across the DoD? How far have you pushed your work out from a tech transfer perspective?
So in terms of the getting the word out, we've been very much looking to find folks that want to collaborate, that want to combine data diode technology potentially with other architectures. And the nice thing about this is this could be the last mile of security. You might have a larger cloud-enabled threat detection system, but there's some parts that are so critical that you really don't want to open them up. So we've been reaching out at trade shows like AEE as well as the SERDP Symposium for quite some time now. The last couple of years we've been out in the field with that. The actual findings from the ESTCP project, that report hasn't been publicized yet, but we're hoping to make those results public at the appropriate time with approval from the ESTCP team.
Thank you so much. And Jonathan and Billy, can one of you weigh in about how your findings, whether they were analyzed and reported for strategic enterprise-wide trends across the DoD? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So kind of the neat thing about working with ESTCP over the last year is the product was used by various assessment teams that were supporting NDAA 1650. And so those assessment teams using our reports reported up their findings through the NDAA 1650 team. And I mean, obviously, we didn't lead that effort, but it's our understanding that especially the R cyber leadership, those reports actually went to Congress because NDAA 1650 is a congressionally mandated effort for critical infrastructure. So, and I know some of the things that BASIC discovered were forwarded in those reports. And then the second piece of this is that there are a few organizations like the Navy and Marine Corps, for example, that are leaning really far forward and trying to get BASIC into other kind of cyber hygiene / mission assurance kind of roles, right? So, as a product, you know, we don't do that reporting, right? It's our customers that take our reports and findings and forward those up to whoever it is that they feel it's appropriate to forward it to. So we won't be doing any direct reporting to any government agencies. It's our customers who will take our data and forward that on.
Thank you. And another question will start with you, Colin. Based on your work, what is the biggest challenge with securing installation infrastructure from cyber-based threats?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges is that, you know, as standardized as some of the machine protocols you would think are, like BACnet and Modbus, you know, there are really a lot of different combinations of manufacturers, of settings, even of different contractors that put things in. There's just a whole lot of different flavors and combinations, so that it's often not something that you can just have one solution that fits everything. But there's certainly benefit to finding those solutions that would work with the majority of systems right now, and really looking for those opportunities to, you know, protect 80% of the building stock with 20% of the effort, and then worrying about the last 20% after that. You know, it's that variety that I think that's really challenging. You know, these aren't like a set of laptops where you can enforce some sort of enterprise Windows controls on it. There's just billions of sensors and end devices, and getting those all to be up to date with patches and updates alone is just a challenge. But there's certainly some technologies out there that alone or in combination that help make us a lot safer.
Thank you so much, Colin. Jonathan, do you have input on this question?
Yeah, I did. Sure, thanks. To me, it's workforce. That's the biggest challenge. We look at the disparate systems that are deployed when we talk the industrial control systems, building automation systems. Having a trained workforce that understands how to secure them properly, having trained cyber professionals or engineers that understand implications of configurations, how to do the analysis on those systems, what the implications are of weak configurations. From that standpoint, is we're woefully behind from a workforce trained perspective on understanding threats, risks to the overall mission set based off some weaknesses in these energy and installation systems. So I think that's my take. I don't know, Billy, if you have something to add.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. You know, like every service, you know, is struggling to, you know, maintain adequate manning for cyber protection teams and mission defense teams. It's just a hard problem to keep up with, and, you know, systems are becoming more and more connected. So I think anything that we can do to scale the capabilities of the existing workforce is a good thing, right? Because ramping up the workforce, especially cybersecurity workforce, it's really hard, it takes time, and it's really expensive. So anything we can do to kind of help make them more efficient and help them scale, I think are big wins in the future.
Great. Thank you both for a really fantastic webinar. At this point, I'd like to go ahead and wrap up and remind all of you that our next webinar is on Thursday, July 23rd in the Environmental Restoration Program area. This webinar will focus on approaches to better characterize PFAS fate and transport in the subsurface, as well as a novel technology to treat PFAS. The webinar will feature Dr. Linda Ebriola from Tufts University, and she'll talk about her experimental mathematical modeling and decision tool development efforts to better understand the processes controlling PFAS fate and transport in the subsurface. And the webinar will also feature Dr. Timothy Stratman from Colorado School of Mines, and he'll talk about his research efforts to develop a technology to treat PFAS in water and other high moisture content waste. Registration is open for this and other future webinars, so please visit the SERDP and SECP webinar webpage to register. Before we conclude, I would like to remind you that both the audio and a copy of the presentation of today's session will be archived on our webinar webpage in case you would like to refer to them in the future. We would appreciate it at this time if you can please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen. This concludes today's webcast. Thank you so much for your attention.